the poor people get stepped on 1,000 different ways.
The Street Outreach Project is a partnership between John Howard Society, The Works, Toronto Police Services, 11, 12, 13, and 14 Division, and it's a plainclothes officer with a harm reduction worker or social worker type person who goes out into the community. Anyone can submit it, any neighbor can submit it, any business can submit the referral, and then the police would then go out, whether if it's with John Howard Society, they actually go out together. And at first when this project began, they weren't identifying themselves as police, so that was like a major issue.
I mean, there's obviously more than one harm reduction community, but I think people engage in harm reduction in totally different ways, right? Like I think there's harm reduction communities of like peer workers who are getting paid to do this sort of work, and then there are people who are just like, you know, like living on the streets, like doing drugs and like just like if they see someone who's like really fucked up, like not calling the cops, like that's harm reduction to me.
I mean, like with anything too, with the police and their co-opting of grassroots techniques and radical techniques, right? It's a way of creating trust, and what ends up happening is sometimes that trust is shifted to those spaces, and then once that trust is placed in, they are in their hands. Right? And then if we're also using that same language, there's that association that's now been made, right? And I think that's the fear, because people end up being put at risk, and then those who originated it.
The harm reduction workers were not aware that the police were going out with these two agencies. It caused a lot of distress, it caused a lot of distrust amongst people on the streets who were then, you know, saying that they saw plainclothes officers with harm reduction outreach workers, that they had engaged with them, and that just like spread like wildfire.
The whole world's built on trust. It's friendship, it's about love and stuff, not about lock me up, throw away the key.
I don't care what anyone says. You have a plainclothes police officer who's apparently going to do service. Once a police officer, always a police officer. They call it the thin blue line for a reason. They are well trained and socialized into having a linear, monolithic type of thinking, and one where they will listen to authority and not question. So therefore, how are you expecting them to go into any other form of work with any other framework of thinking?
We don't need cops to do that role. They're not social workers, they're not community workers, they're not outreach workers, they're law enforcement. And they need to be also clear about what their role is. And if they're finding that they don't have enough work to do, then they need to take a budget cut. They need to cut police from the force, and they could actually give that money to the organizations who know how to do the work and who, you know, don't want to do it in a way that's just about like public order and public disorder and moving people along, but actually, you know, care about structural and systemic issues, which cops do not care about.
For the police to accompany harm reduction workers, nurses, is unethical right from the beginning. They knew it. There's an animosity. A straight person, a regular person, wouldn't go to their doctor or social worker with a police officer in the room and expect to solve any problems. They're not coming back the next time, that's for sure.
So the relationship between police and people who use drugs is super contested. While people who use drugs and harm reduction workers have a very good relationship with each other and have spent, you know, decades of building that trust and rapport.
See, we know how to deal with people with lived experience and show them where the best agencies, because we've actually been to the different agencies, and where to go that'll be the smoothest route to get what they need.
So we decided the Toronto Drug Users Union didn't want to have a back and forth. We wanted to have a public meeting, so we partnered with the Toronto Harm Reduction Alliance. We really wanted to make it an open dialogue so they could actually hear back from people who were feeling really opposed to it and have that space to do that. A closed-door conversation kind of leaves you just going back and forth, and it doesn't give people much power to actually like verbalize how they're feeling. And it is really important that people who are the most impacted get the opportunity to share their concern. Out of the forum, they decided to stop what they were doing and take a break, which was really important, and I would say that was like a win. So yeah, also the police were supposed to be wearing identifiers. So if they were in plain clothes or whether they were in uniform, they need to identify who they were. So they did say that they would be wearing badges around their necks, which, you know, again, I would say that that's crucial, a win for us to get them to do that. I think for me that the big win would be that they just ended. Yeah, so the harm reduction community essentially came out of the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And so, you know, drug users and people who were concerned about people who were dying of AIDS and people who were dying of AIDS were really the first to start needle exchanges in the city of Toronto. But people have been practicing harm reduction long before needle exchanges even happened. People have been showing each other how to use safely, how to take care of each other, how to kick drugs. So drug users themselves have been practicing harm reduction for a long time. But the institution of harm reduction really came about through the 80s and the establishment of needle exchanges. And so Toronto actually has a lot of needle exchanges. There's like about 40 agencies that hand out needle exchange supplies. How that looks varies between agencies. Some are quite comprehensive, some are just handing out a kit at a desk. But then over the years, the real push to have the inclusion of people who use drugs and to all the roles within harm reduction organizations has been something that's been going on for decades. And, you know, people wanting to actually organize around issues that really affect drug users. So for instance, the Safer Crack Use Coalition was something that was started in Toronto. The Safer Crack Use Coalition were the people who established Safer Crack Kits. Safer Crack Kits were established here, and then, you know, they're all over the world. People are using them as a tool to engage with crack users. We started that here, and it is something within harm reduction. We're really proud that we've always been in Toronto, very progressive and on the forefront of, you know, making change and delivering services. And so, yeah, we have a very large group of people who are harm reduction workers, and I would say majority of those today are lots of people with lived experience of using drugs. So police not disclosing that they were engaging with the community, even just right off the start, people didn't know that that was happening. So harm reduction workers were not aware that the police were going out with these two agencies. It caused a lot of distress. It caused a lot of distrust amongst people on the streets who were then, you know, saying that that they saw plainclothes officers with harm reduction outreach workers, that they had engaged with them, and that just like spread like wildfire. And I think, you know, that in itself has created harm already, and police not saying that they're cops is like very dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous, and it's really misleading, and it creates like a level of distress amongst harm reduction workers that we've like worked decades to build, and it puts people who use drugs in total harm's way. I think my concern, and I think it's super valid, is the kind of the collection of data, the more access that police have to drug users, the more fear I have about their safety. So it was a really big challenge when the police first came on and were going out, and it caused like too much distress. So I first heard about the Street Outreach Project at a Toronto Harm Reduction Workers Union meeting. So somebody who'd been on the advisory at the work started talking about how this project might happen, and we were all very concerned. That sounded far out there. We were like, there is no way that organizations in harm reduction will be working with police in this kind of manner. You know, I guess you just make assumptions over the years that everybody has a really good politic around the relationship between police and drug users, and that there's a recognition that there is a massive power dynamic there that is really problematic, and also that people have some historical understanding of the role of police in this country and how, you know, like First Nations people's relationship to police, the way that police and social workers have been used throughout decades, of like taking people's children, to removing people from their home, to, you know, police and the use in the mental health system. So and also, like, we live in a city where people are being killed by police, and where, you know, police are being called out for racial profiling, and that's going on, and the carding of homeless people, and the targeting of people on the streets. So that in itself was really shocking to hear that anybody would actually partner in this way. So when hearing about it, we were like, okay, I think I need to just take a step back and just write the organizations and find out what's really going on. So I went to the Toronto Drug Users Union, which I'm a member of, and asked what we should do, and they asked if I would write the management at the works to find out what was happening. So I wrote them, and it sounded from the email interaction that it was just a project where like it was, teaching police more about harm reduction, where, if someone was in distress, instead of arresting them, like the harm reduction people could be the ones to intervene. It didn't sound at all like cops were going to be present. So we weren't really alarmist. We were like, okay, maybe this is like a good way. Maybe this will like stop people from being arrested or having to go through court system. It didn't sound terrible. But then Parkdale, one day in Parkdale, an undercover or plainclothes officer and an outreach worker were in Parkdale doing outreach, which was really bizarre since Parkdale has its own outreach workers, why other people are doing outreach in Parkdale. And it caused like, people were just in uproar. They could not believe that police were there, that they were plain clothes, that they were out with an outreach worker. And that's how organizations found out. And so the Users Union again wrote management at the works just to ask what the project was about. We had correspondence, but then we decided as a union that we were actually super opposed to this, that this was actually quite dangerous, that no one had been consulted, so that if we were going to be working with the police, there should be extensive consultation as to what that looks like. And it really needs to come from people who are having like firsthand experience with the police. So I think like people who use drugs should be very instrumental in like what that should look like or could look like, if at all look like. A closed door conversation kind of leaves you just going back and forth, and it doesn't give people much power to actually like verbalize how they're feeling. And I was being tasked as the person to be communicating, but there was a lot of voices who wanted to speak up about it. And it is really important that people who are the most impacted get the opportunity to share their concerns and have that forum to do that. And I think that's actually the way we should be doing things like this that are like controversial and really impact people negatively. And the outcomes of like involving police just are so huge, from police being able to know people's HIV status and being able to use that further in like if there's ever like a criminal, because we're like the top criminalizers of HIV in the world. I think a lot of harm reduction workers are feeling like more tokenized in their role and less valued for their opinions as far as like what's happened with this partnership. And I think that's something that the organizations involved really need to hear about and need to think about. And I think that there's never been an apology. So no one's ever said, hey, you know what, we messed up here, we're really sorry, like maybe it wasn't a good idea, and actually a lot of your points here are completely valid. Like that actually hasn't happened and didn't happen. And I think that the organizations involved need to just say, oh, wait a second, there actually are really valid concerns here. We shouldn't just slough them off. I think that the works recognized that when they decided to like stop doing the outreach with the police. They listened to the community, they heard the problems that people were feeling. But John Howard Society, they decided that they wanted to continue and actually didn't really acknowledge any of the concerns people had. And they were like, this is great for us because we've engaged with people in the community that we haven't engaged with before. And it's like, yeah, because you're new in that neighborhood, first of all, so let's be clear about that. They've just moved into the neighborhood that they're doing outreach in. And second of all, you could actually just hire outreach workers without the same salaries as police. It's like a weird dynamic, first of all, that you have a cop who makes over $100,000 a year doing outreach with someone who's probably making $10,000 a year as a harm reduction worker, doing that together. That in itself is like really strange in harm reduction. It's pretty underpaid, like precarious work in itself. And that's a lot of money, unnecessary money. But also they could be having outreach work. If there's a need for outreach workers, then they by all means should hire outreach workers that aren't police. And that's easy to do. Yeah. And if we're finding that, we lost a lot of funding for outreach, it's been hard to get outreach workers. Like when the city created Streets to Homes, we lost lots of funding for winter survival items that we used to hand out. There was like a real move away from having outreach on the streets. And if people and organizations are feeling like that's a need, then organizations need to get together and make demands around funding for those roles again, because there are a lot of people on the streets and there's a lot of need, but we don't need cops to do that role. They're not social workers, they're not community workers, they're not outreach workers, they're law enforcement. And they need to be also clear about what their role is. And if they're finding that they don't have enough work to do, then they need to take a budget cut. They need to cut police from the force, and they could actually give that money to the organizations who know how to do the work and who, you know, don't want to do it in a way that's just about like public order and public disorder and moving people along, but actually, you know, care about structural and systemic issues, which cops do not care about. So after the meeting, I think people felt like, I think there was a lot of hurt feelings. So, and that's really unfortunate. Like, people really take this stuff really personally, and fair enough. I think the drug users I know and the harm reduction workers who use drugs or have the lived experience of using drugs felt really hurt. They felt really upset that there was no acknowledgement about like this kind of partnership and the way that and the kind of relationship police have to them in their daily lives. And it also showed that we have a real disconnect of like who's working in harm reduction and the way that we see police, and that's really troublesome actually. And I think that there needs to be some full training. Police don't just need training around harm reduction, but workers, frontline workers who've engaged in this, who think this project is okay, actually need some anti-oppression training. They need some full on, like, they need some education around police and like the drug war. And so I think like after that meeting, some people have some kind of contentious feelings towards each other, and I don't know how that can be fixed, but I think it needs to be. Mm-hmm. And I think there was like a few articles that came out, and then we had like a meeting between the different groups that were interested in coming together. So at that meeting, it was decided that another group would get together to talk about this project and the ways it could or could not move forward. And so I did go to that meeting along with I think there was like 30 people at that meeting from different organizations. And I went as a member of the Toronto Drug Users Union. And it was, again, like just kind of teaching the police about what we do. I wouldn't, and the organizations having to listen to like how people were feeling. So the Works had decided to stop. Out of the forum, they decided to stop what they were doing and take a break, which was really important, and I would say that was like a win and really good on their part as well to do that. Like, that must have been hard. Take that on the chin. Just stop what you're doing. So they stopped and like had to reassess what they're doing. So they've said that when they started up again, that it was just a referral, so that they wouldn't go out with the police. So it is our understanding that they're not going out with the police, but they will take the referrals from the police's like street outreach project online. John Howard Society, on the other hand, continues. And so if people interact with John Howard in those divisions, then they need to be aware that they may be interacting with the police. So yeah, also the police were supposed to be wearing identifiers. So if they were in plain clothes or whether they were in uniform, they need to identify who they were. So they did say that they would be wearing badges around their necks, which, you know, again, I would say that that's crucial, a win for us to get them to do that. I think for me that the big win would be that they just end it and that none of this goes on. I think the project itself came out of the Cornerstone shelter being moved and at St. Clair and Oakwood Vaughan area, and there was some community concern, but there was also a lot of community support for the move of the shelter. People felt really good about the shelter, but there was a lot of like hatred around homeless people and where will they go, and you know, what about the children, and those kinds of views were being expressed, which were really discriminatory. And this project came out of that, and it came out of another a methadone clinic that's in another ward that has been in the same spot for 20 years and never had any problems, but then the local counselor found out about it and then made this big stink. But really, again, just like rallying neighbors against something that's, again, just like full of hatred, being super discriminatory, And so, this is what this project came out of. It's really about public order, and it's about, how we view other people in our society, and how we view people on the streets negatively. For me, I would love to see this project stopped. I don't think harm reduction workers should be in the role of helping with cleaning up, quote unquote, the streets. We meet people where they're at. That is our job. We don't move people along. If we see a person panhandling, homeless on the street, we're not trying to.
Harm reduction community. I mean, there's obviously more than one harm reduction community, but I think people engage in harm reduction in totally different ways, right? I think there's harm reduction communities of peer workers who are getting paid to do this sort of work and are collecting cash off of doing peer support work and doing state recognized harm reduction work. And then there are people who just sort of like myself, who kind of just understand harm reduction as a framework and are engaging in some sort of harm reduction work with communities. And then there are people who are just living on the streets, doing drugs and just if they see someone who's really fucked up, not calling the cops, that's harm reduction to me. And not calling an ambulance, things like that. I facilitate support groups for queer and trans youth looking to incorporate harm reduction principles and strategies into their substance use. I mean, harm reduction, I think the way I see it before, it was kind of what's the word? Sort of glamorized and sensationalized and co-opted by even nonprofits and other sort of agencies. It was something that communities of substance users did. It's just common sense. If you're going to engage in something that does have sort of those sorts of effects, you're going to want to figure out ways and develop mechanisms and protocols to keep each other safe. I think the idea of involving the police is kind of again antithetical to that, because the police are the people who are doing or not even the people, but the institution and the agent of the state that is doing the most harm to substance users by criminalizing them, by enforcing these mandatory or minimum sentences, things like that, and are part of the state that's also retracting into nothingness and allowing private companies and nonprofits to come in and build and accumulate capital off of the current state of things, the current political landscape and lack of social services. It's really fucked up. I think it totally makes sense under this liberal ideology around how do we take care of substance users? We involve the police, because the police are this sort of arm of the state that's all about protecting and serving and all that sort of stuff. To sort of mask the fact that these are actually the people who are causing the most harm to people that are experiencing the brunt of economic and racial violence, and who are responding to that by using substances and engaging in survival economies and things like that. So I think I was obviously super outraged by it, also because I live in the neighborhood that they're targeting, and so the idea of having plainclothes police officers who are going to just try and engage with people on the streets, on top of Toronto Police's terrible record in terms of racial profiling and all other sorts of violence with I don't know, just with targeted communities by the police. But I think it was also just predictable. I think it's an easy narrative to co-opt by the municipal government and sort of use that idea of helping people and doing harm reduction to enhance their agendas around gentrification, around social cleansing and ethnic cleansing and things like that. People who witness something on the streets can report it to the police and get them to get them to involve like themselves in it. The idea being that like if you see someone who's like acting neurotic or like committing some sort of crime and like looks like they could be like high or like fucked up on some drug, you can submit this online referral form saying like where did it happen, what was like the description of the person, do you know anything more about them, and the police can then sort of like come in and intervene, which I think is like obviously like really stupid because like when police intervene you don't know what's going to happen based on like the background of the person who you're engaging with, especially if they're a substance user, especially if like depending on their like immigration status, their like racial background, their class, like their occupation, like there are a lot of different factors that can involve like how violent the intervention with the police becomes. And I think it's just like super transparent, or not even transparent, I think it's just like really implicitly a way for like middle class, like upper middle class people to sort of just see something that they don't like in their neighborhood, in their like gentrified neighborhood, and report it, so that homeless people, people living in poverty, substance users, etc., are just like eradicated from the neighborhood instead of actually like met with like services and like respect and like any form of compassion at all. Yeah.
Do you think you could put like a sentence together explaining like at the beginning like there's this new thing called the online referral form, just so there's like a bit of context to a soundbite?
Yeah. So there's also this new, I mean, as part of the project, the idea was to have a sort of like referral form. So
My role in the harm reduction communities was starting up a peer-based street outreach program called Peer to Peer in Vancouver in the Grandview Woodlands district. We did it out of our own pockets for years and finally got funding from the Public Health, Vancouver Coastal Health. The police were on board and the Business Improvement Association. They saw what great things we were doing and we got funding. The program is still running and this is 2016. See, we know how to deal with people with lived experience. We know how to settle a situation down if it's getting out of hand, and to deal with the people and show them we're the best agencies, because we've actually been to the different agencies and where to go that'll be the smoothest route to get what they need. And it saves the taxpayer a fortune. You know, we're not working on an hourly wage of $30 an hour and up. We're doing it out of the goodness of our heart. We've been there. We've seen it. We know how the system functions. The poor people get stepped on 1,000 different ways. The police to accompany harm reduction workers, nurses, is unethical right from the beginning. They knew it. There's an animosity. A straight person, a regular person, wouldn't go to their doctor or social worker with a police officer in the room and expect to solve any problems. They're not coming back the next time, that's for sure. And they've lost friendship with all these nurses and outreach workers that have been doing it for years. Lost trust. What the heck is going on? And in plain clothes. What for? Police know nothing. They don't have training in this. When their training is actually drug users, lock them up. Yeah. Get a day in court, get paid more money, or court day. It's all about the money. Well, trust plays a role since you're a child, since you're a baby. You have to trust in your parents and trust in civilization. When something is throwing a roadblock in the way, what the heck? I gotta go somewhere else. The whole world's built on trust. Your workplace, you go into work. You've got to trust your boss to pay you. You've got to trust your boss for everything, that things are working out. It's friendship. It's about love and stuff, not about lock me up, throw away the key. Yeah, it was. I think it was through the Google groups, the THRA. It was a newsflash. A reporter wants to talk to people about the police outreach program, and then the meeting was shortly arranged down at Queen West, and I was full shocked right from the very beginning. What the heck is this? The more information I received about it, the crazier it got.
Yeah. Can you tell me about that?
Police on street outreach work with public health nurses and people with lived experience. There's no sense in it. Wait a second. There's absolutely no sense. Because the policeman's role is to uphold the law for the rich and stuff. They're not concerned about the low-hanging fruit. You know, it's move along, boys, for the most insignificant little thing. Move along, give you a ticket, give you another ticket, give you a ticket all day long. It's nonsense. Like the police officer at the meeting says, oh, we'll help them find housing. Wait a second, since when is the police involved in housing? Jails, maybe. Yeah. Some people in the harm reduction industry immediately put out information, made everybody aware, and set up a meeting, and 100 people showed up. About, yeah, the executive director put in her 2 cents in worth at Queen West. Yeah. And they sat on the panel just like stones, you know. Yeah, it's dysfunctional not to have the people that you're working with for their input. You want input. Let's say, you got to gather wisdom from all sides and stuff and put it together. It's not like, okay, we know what's best for you. No, wait a second. When you, anywhere in the world, you go anywhere in the world and people are in trouble, you ask them, what do you need? Not, this is what you need. It doesn't work that way. At the meeting at Queen West was that I had a meeting with a bunch of doctors. They said this is unethical, and none of you panel members would go to your doctor's office or your priest's office with a police officer in the room. Just use your head. Simple logic.